Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly discussion series that's hosted by the Chaldean Cultural Center in collaboration with U of M Detroit Center, Unique Voices in Films, and CMN TV. My guest today is Professor Howard Lupovitch. Hello, it's nice to have you.
Good morning.
Howard is a fourth generation Detroiter and a graduate of Hillel Day School, the University of Michigan, and Columbia University, where he earned a PhD in Jewish history. He is professor of history and director of the Cohen Haddo Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State University. He has also taught at Cornell University, Colby College, the University of Western Ontario, and the University of Michigan, where he was also a fellow at the Frankel Institute for Advanced Jewish Studies. He is the author most recently of Translithuanian. Did I chop that? Okay. Paradise, a history of the Budapest Jewish community, and is currently writing a history of the Neolog movement in Judaism and a history of the Jews of Detroit since 1967. Wow, you're like the perfect person to have in May for Jewish History Month.
Thank you.
I mean, actually, it was Rabbi Jeff that he came with his group, and they visited the museum. And then I told him about that we are honoring May is Jewish Heritage Month, and that he recommended you're the first person that he recommended. And then we ended up meeting through other projects that you're doing, which we'll discuss shortly. But first, can you tell us a bit about your background and upbringing as a fourth generation Detroiter? What was it like growing up in the Detroit area?
Oh, well, thank you. First of all, thanks again for having me. It's really a pleasure to be part of this important program. So my family came to Detroit directly from Eastern Europe. I mean, that's the short version of it. I had three out of four grandparents were born at various places in Eastern Europe, one in Ukraine and one in Lithuania and one in Romania. One grandmother was actually born here in 1900. Her parents came from Eastern Europe probably 10 years before that. And my family story is very much the story of Jews in Detroit. So they lived on 12th Street, then they lived on Dexter, and then we bypassed Northwest Detroit and we lived in Oak Park, that's where I was born. And then we moved to West Bloomfield in 1969. And I grew up in West Bloomfield after the age of 5. And growing up here, for me, I mean, this is a really wonderful Jewish community. And of course, as you know, Detroit, Metro Detroit is a great place to grow up. It's that combination of Midwest, but also just strong communities and strong sense of identity. So I mostly grew up in West Bloomfield, and my life was really dictated by certain parts of the Jewish community. I went to a Jewish day school, Hillel Day School, which in those days was very small. Today it's much larger. It was a newer school. We're conservative Jews, which means we're not exactly Orthodox. Certainly, we're traditional in certain ways. And I grew up at a conservative synagogue. I was bar mitzvahed at a Dat Shalom synagogue in Farmington Hills. And I think in some ways I had a pretty typical upbringing here. Growing up in the suburbs, I went to West Bloomfield High School. Well, when I was there weren't that many Jews there. I went to the University of Michigan. That's what a lot of kids did.
Well, you have quite an impressive academic background with degrees, from as I mentioned earlier, Hillel Day School, the University of Michigan, PhD from Columbia University. What sparked your initial interest in Jewish history? I mean, you're kind of sharing that right now, but not everybody ends up. The last person that I interviewed, his brother is quite religious. Scott Rosenfeld was the last person that I interviewed 2 weeks ago, but he's in the film industry, and he tends to be more spiritual than religious. So not necessarily, even though you're Jewish, you don't necessarily go and start teaching all of that. But what sparked that in you? Where was there an incident, or who were you inspired by, and what led to your career choices?
Great question. I mean, I always grew up with a strong Jewish identity, but my interest in studying Jewish history academically, I came to it indirectly. Because when I was an undergraduate, I was a history major. History was my first love. And I wasn't initially interested in Jewish history as an area of specialization. In fact, when I was at the University of Michigan, there was really no one teaching Jewish history. They were kind of between Jewish historians. And when I was a senior, a new historian arrived who was really good. He was there for many years, named Todd Endelman. And when I took his course, I just knew that I loved history, but it was so much more personal to study my own history academically. So that's really what sparked the interest. And then a series of other mentors and teachers led me to study the Jews of Eastern Europe and then the Jews of Hungary. So I really, it really was a question of one mentor or one impressive role model after the next. But I really came to it via the study of history.
Okay. And you know, that often happens where we are drawn, like as a Chaldean myself, when I was born, we were talking about this the other day, being born in Baghdad, I didn't really look at myself or understand what it was to be Chaldean. And it took years later as an adult to start understanding who I was and why it's important to learn about my history. So just, gravitating towards that. As the director of the Cohen Haddo Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State University, what are some of the key initiatives or areas of focus for that center, and how do they contribute to the academic study of Jewish history and culture in the Detroit region?
That's a great question too. So the center's been around for a little over 30 years, and its mission in a lot of ways is parallel to the broader mission of Wayne State University. So Wayne State University is a place to provide academic learning in a variety of subjects. The Cohen Haddo Center provides academic learning for Jewish subjects, and Wayne State University engages the broader community, providing academic learning opportunities. The Cohen Haddo Center provides academic Jewish learning opportunities for the broader community. So the programs we do consists of a lot of things. First of all, we partner with a lot of other organizations and institutions in the city, with congregations, with the Jewish Federation, with the Jewish Community Center, with the Holocaust Museum. We work with other communities to do programs together. And we're really, the goal and the real mission of the center is to give people an opportunity to learn about various aspects of Judaism in a way which is, well, the center is non-denominational and it's apolitical. We're kind of a neutral academic or neutral learning space where we can really look at all facets of something without being bound by a particular denomination or religious affiliation or political outlook. It really frees us up to do a lot of different things.
And so by the way, I went to Wayne State University, and it's interesting when you said it's fairly new, 30 years, but I graduated a little bit before I think it even started. You know, I love Wayne State. I feel like right now something was coming to mind as you were talking. It seems like because it's so diverse and it doesn't really have that kind of it doesn't engage in ways it really embraces all different faiths and all different backgrounds, and it's just really the perfect place for it, it seems, because that was my experience when I went, even though it was a long time ago when I went to Wayne State University.
Absolutely. I would also say that it isn't just the diversity of Wayne, which is remarkably diverse, but also as a university campus, Wayne still has a rich culture of civil discourse and constructive debate, which these days is becoming, I think rarer and rarer. On Wayne campus, students, faculty, we're still able to really discuss things, even discuss difficult things, difficult questions in a way which is civil and constructive.
Oh, that's an excellent point. I did not think of that, but that is really what is even more important, because there are a lot of areas that are diverse, but there's people are having less and less using the art of debate as a way to communicate. So your book, I'm really interested to hear about your recent book, which I'm having a hard time with the first word, but it's
Translitanian. I can
okay.
explain the
So
word if you want.
I do actually, but I'd love to know, what inspired you to write this book and what it's about.
Thank you. I love talking about this book. I spent a long time writing it. So the word Translitanian, back when there was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was a dual monarchy, and the kind of the symbolic dividing point between the two sides, the Austrian-Hungarian parts of the monarchy, was the Leita River, which today is on the border of Austria and Hungary. And so officially, the Austrian side of Austria-Hungary, its official name was Cisleitania, which means on this side of the Leita River. And so the Hungarian side of the monarchy was Transleitania, the other side of the Leita River. So you only saw Cisleitania and Transleitania in official documents. In common terms, it was called Austria and Hungary. Now, the reason I called the book this book of story about the Jews of Budapest, Transleitanian Paradise, was for Jews in Hungary in general, and especially for Jews in Budapest before World War I, before 1914, this was a place that was virtually devoid of anti-Semitism. There was some in Hungary. There was very little in Budapest. After the war, things changed, and things for Jews went from being very good to very bad very quickly. But the phrase Transleitanian Paradise was used by one of the founders of Zionism. You know, Zionism, some of its early founders were Hungarian Jews, like Theodor Herzl was born in Budapest, and Max Nordau was born in Budapest. And another founder of Zionism, when for Zionists, they were very concerned about anti-Semitism spreading across Europe. So a colleague of Herzl, whose name was Alexander Marx, he described anti-Semitism everywhere, but he said for Jews, Budapest was a Transleitanian paradise. It was one of the few places in Eastern Europe or in Central Europe where there wasn't that much anti-Semitism. So the story of the book is really the story about how it came to be where Budapest was such a welcoming place for Jews until World War I, and then how it became a very unwelcoming place for Jews after World War I, and then during the years leading up to the Holocaust.
This is a very important, I think, book probably to read right now, given all the situation. So I'm really intrigued, and we had a conversation about this when we met the other day in person, where I'm interested more in learning, where did this ideology stem? We were talking about that. And I think it's because sometimes you wonder the anti-Semitism, the way it's kind of coming back, you really want to see, like, where is the root of that? Because the only way that you can hopefully try to, heal a situation and prevent it from happening again is to understand it. So I've become very interested in that. But do you, from doing the book, why was Buddhism, what was the place? Budapest. Why didn't they have that, or why did it only happen? Like, why did it have the least anti-Semitism? What is it about their culture that led to that?
It's a great question. It is a complex question. I'll try to distill it down for you as best as I can, because much of the book deals with that. Part of the reason is that I think this is something true about big cities in general. Big cities that have a diverse population, and Budapest was an increasingly diverse population when you have lots of different peoples living there. Not only Jews and a bunch of, you have Protestants and you have Catholics and different denominations, peoples of all kinds. It becomes more difficult to single out one minority. In Budapest, Jews were one of several minorities. And the city, because it was a city, had a very cosmopolitan feel. People who moved to Budapest were people who weren't afraid to encounter other people who were different. So I think that was part of the atmosphere. The other thing about it, though, in a very practical way, is that Jews who moved there played an important role in helping to build the city, not only the city's commerce, but also the city's culture. And it was for people who lived in Budapest, whether they were Jewish or otherwise, it was difficult to imagine the city without its Jewish community. But the one other part of it as well, and this was sort of the Hungarian part of it, the reason that the Hungarians, the ethnic Magyars, were positively disposed towards Jews, there was a much more practical element to it as well. So it really has two parts. First of all, Hungary as a country into the 20th century was still a country that was dominated by its nobility, by its nobles. And whereas in other parts of Europe, the nobility had been basically overthrown or removed or weakened or marginalized by liberal ideas, what's unusual about Hungary is that it was the nobles themselves who were trying to make the country more liberal. So they had a kind of a more traditional or conservative form of liberalism. And nobles in Hungary, who were the real power brokers, they had a close working relationship with Jews, which started as a commercial relationship. They would be in business together. And then it became a more political relationship where Jews were seen as a useful political ally. But then it also became a cultural relationship. And this is the Hungarian part of it, where the ethnic Hungarians were a minority in their own country. Hungary, I mean, this is the larger Hungary from before World War One, which included what is today Slovakia and Croatia and parts of Romania. It was only 45% Hungarian. There were many other minorities. And so the Hungarians were an ethnic minority in their own country at a time when being the ethnic or national majority was very important. And so the numbers were interesting because it was 45% Hungarian. This is the country that was 45% Hungarian, and it was 6% Jewish. So if you do the math, 45% plus 6% equals ethnic majority. So it was very much in the interest of the Hungarians to have Jews become Hungarian, to acculturate, to embrace the language and the culture, so they could be able to count them as not as a separate group, but as Hungarians of the Jewish faith. So there was this practical incentive for the dominant part of the country, and this was especially true in Budapest, to see Jews as fellow Hungarians, not just loyal citizens, but also really as part of the dominant nation and culture. Now, that was true until the end of World War One. World War One, two-thirds of the country was given away, and the ethnic Hungarians were an overwhelming majority in their own country. They didn't need the Jews as much. So that was one of several reasons why the situation turned sour after World War One. But until then, that was very true. And that was especially true in Budapest, because Budapest was the epitome of this multinational, this politically and culturally diverse place where Jews were seen, or Hungarians of the Jewish faith were seen as an integral element to building a society and a culture and a politics and an economy.
When you were sharing this, it sounds familiar to, right now, I was telling you that we are expanding the museum. We're moving the museum. And one of the, we have a little bit information about the Jewish when they lived during the Babylonian era, and during the Babylonian Empire, when Nebuchadnezzar brought them through exile, he brought them to Babylon, and he did so because he brought the best of the best. They were brilliant, and he wanted them to help build the empire. And then in 2015, there was over 100 tablets that were discovered that talked about the life of the Jews in Babylon. And what we're doing in the new museum, we're expanding the exhibit to include some of these tablets. And I got in touch with the person, as an Israeli-British man, David Sofer, who purchased all the tablets. But yeah,
Yeah.
he's pretty wealthy, but he's very nice as well. And so I contact him to kind of see the different tablets, what we should incorporate. There's a huge book that I went through, and I have to go through it over again, that has the tablets, and they're all translated. It was written by a professor from Cornell University. But the reason I'm sharing this is because, so they were brought over by Nebuchadnezzar, and many of them stayed because of the religious historical significance of that land of Mesopotamia to Prophet Abraham, and because at that time they were now speaking Aramaic. There was a very strong Jewish community was established in that area. And it's not one of my questions, but I really want you to speak a little bit about that, because it was very strong, and it developed, and it continued for a while. Unfortunately, it no longer exists. I don't know if that's the case in Budapest or not. If after World War One and all that happened, were they able to return? Were they able to reestablish that? But unfortunately, in Iraq, it went from being a very, very strong community to, dwindling in numbers. If you could just share a little bit about that, I would love to
Well, yeah.
hear.
Well, first of all, yeah, I mean, in Iraq, I mean, the Jewish community of Iraq is the original diaspora community, and they lived there for a very, very long time. And you're right; it really came to an end at the end of the 1930s or the 1940s or a little around there. It sort of ended, but for 2,500 years before, I mean, this was
2,500 years.
which is remarkable. I think the only Jewish community that's as old are Persian Jews or Iranian Jews, which is basically the same, really part of the same diaspora. Um, but yes, they were there for a long time, and a lot of it was actually quite good. I mean, there's that period of where Jews living in Baghdad, when Baghdad was actually becoming an important city in the Muslim
The House
Caliphate.
of Wisdom. It was called the House of Wisdom back then.
Yes,
All the different people and the academics and scholars would come from all over the world to visit different languages that they spoke.
it was remarkable, and Jews were very much part of it. And this is where Jewish philosophers, or the first Jewish philosophers like Saadia Gaon or even Maimonides, they learned the culture, they learned their philosophy, they embraced that broader view of learning from their Muslim and Christian neighbors in Baghdad and other parts of Iraq. So it is a long and rich and richly textured history. And of course, it's just tragic that that Jewish community had to come to an end. That
It is
circumstances
tragic,
ended
right?
it.
And
So,
everybody feels like everybody, Muslims and Christians alike, feel that it's very tragic because they contributed greatly to the country.
and what made Iraq and Baghdad so, the culture so rich was, there was one historian who called it convivencia, or coexistence, where you have three major religions just living together in relative stability,
Mhm.
oftentimes peacefully, and this exchange of culture that went on for centuries. So it did it reached this sort of end for Jews in Budapest. I think that was the other thing you asked, is that,
Yeah, like in
after,
comparison, did it come back or was it
well,
destroyed?
after World War One, things got worse. Until 1938, most Jews in Budapest, the community was about 200,000. It was about 20% of the overall population of the city. And until 1938, things got worse, but the Jews were, I guess, to put it simply, they were able to weather it. At 1938, long story short, this is when the anti-Semitic president of Hungary, Horthy, really began to gravitate. Well, he allied with Hitler, and from 1938 till 1944, the community basically they began to, things got worse there. In 1944, when Eichmann and the Nazis began to govern Hungary and Budapest directly, this is when Hungarian Jews were deported. Now, the reason a Jewish community in Budapest was able to survive all of that and survive, and some of them were able to survive the Holocaust, was really two things. Is, first of all, Adolf Eichmann was sort of one of Hitler's sort of right-hand men. He had a two-stage plan for Hungarian Jews in terms of deporting them to the death camps, mainly to Auschwitz. So the first stage was the countryside, and the Hungarian countryside, the towns and cities, small towns and villages of the countryside, was just emptied of Jews in the summer of 44. The second stage, though, was Budapest. And Eichmann didn't get to the second stage because Budapest was liberated by the Soviet army before the Jewish community of Budapest could all be deported. So that's part of the reason that many survived, simply a timing thing, luck. The other part is there was a very righteous person, a righteous Swedish diplomat in Budapest whose name was Raoul Wallenberg, who single-handedly saved 30,000 Jews in Budapest for purely humanitarian reasons. Incidentally, he went to the University of Michigan. He got a degree in architecture from the University of Michigan. But Wallenberg was just this amazing story. And so even after the war, and even today, there is a Jewish community in Budapest of around 100,000. And it couldn't do very much as long as Hungary was a communist country. But since the 1990s, when the communists left and Hungary, at least for a time, became a more liberal and democratic country, there was this Jewish renaissance there. I'll give you a number. In 1988, there were maybe 30 Jewish children in Budapest involved in some kind of Jewish education. By 1992, once the communists were gone, there were several Jewish day schools. One of them, the Anna Frank School, had over 1,000 Jewish students. So it's a community that's really, it's having difficulties because the president of Hungary is, he's more liberal and he's tougher. There's new restrictions, but they are there. There is a prospering community. It's one of the few Jewish communities in Central or Eastern Europe that was able to survive the Holocaust in these numbers.
Is this story kind of, I mean, I've never heard of the story, by the way, and
Oh
I can.
well, and yeah.
Okay, so is this story? Do you feel like it doesn't have the recognition that it probably deserves? Because I'm somebody that reads a lot. I mean,
Mm.
and look into a lot of the history, whether the Jews or other, and I have not heard of this amazing story. It's
Well,
such an inspiring story, and plus that one person, it kind of gives us this feeling because sometimes when you see what's happening and you wonder, how can we help in this situation? And you don't like seeing what's happening because you care about all people involved and you want to bring peace through some form of something. And then here's this man that you're talking about that I feel like needs to be recognized more, or this story needs to be out. But is there a reason that it doesn't stand out as much as should be?
well, first of all, I'd say,
Location? Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe
20
it is.
years ago they made a TV movie about him. I mean that Wallenberg was, I think he was played by Richard Harris in the movie. So, and there are books about him. I mean, there are things about, but I think the reason, to your question, the reason it doesn't get, it's not more front and central, is that the story of Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust doesn't always fit the exact, the narrative of the Holocaust. It's a little different. Hungarian Jews were involved later. The chain of events was a little bit different. Still was enormously difficult. They're the exception in a lot of ways. So if you study the Holocaust just a little, you don't always get to the Hungarian part because it's a separate chapter of the story, even though there are similar things. And I think Wallenberg, I think he's pretty well known among Jews, especially Jews who are aware of not only the story of the Holocaust, but the story of righteous Gentiles during the Holocaust. He's like Schindler, except Schindler saved 1,000. He saved 30,000, and in an ingenious way. So,
And I think that's probably what I was referring to. Everybody knows Schindler, of course, because of the film and all
because
the
of the
hype.
film, but
Right. So
you're right. We
when
probably
you
need a
said
new
the
movie
numbers,
about.
I thought, wait a minute, these numbers, I mean, he should be known, he should be more in the forefront, not only because of the extent of what he did, but then to top it off, I, I don't know, maybe this is the time for something like that. We need to hear those kind of stories and see how one man could stand up to something like this and, whether to save people or to change some narratives I think are missing from history more than they ought to be. So I'm so glad you wrote this book about it.
Well, actually, my book stops in 1938, but there are other people
Oh,
who have written about
written
Wallenberg.
about him.
And
But even about writing about that community, I had no idea. Like I'm taking down the numbers and the years, and I had not heard about that because I had heard more of where the numbers dwindled, where the numbers disappeared, including like as we mentioned in Iraq and a lot of major
yeah.
places in the Middle East. So those are the areas that become the focus. But then you don't see the other areas that the opposite was happening, and you want to know how did that happen because it's nice to replicate it somehow.
The other reason why the Hungarian story is always often left out of, not just in terms of this, but in terms of Jewish history generally, is the language. Hungarian is a language that's sort of in its own class, and no one and there aren't many people who speak the language. So just academically or in a scholarly way, it doesn't get studied as much. But I agree with you; it's a very important story, and it's a very uplifting story. I mean, the story has a tragic end because after the war, after we saved all these Jews, when the Soviets came into Budapest, they suspected him of being a Nazi sympathizer because he worked with the Nazis to be able to save these Jews. So he was taken to a Soviet prison camp in 1945 and never heard from again. And no one knows. There were rumors that he died sometime in the 1970s, but he basically, after saving all those people I guess it's in a one of this tragedy, he just sort of disappeared. He was presumably executed by the Soviet Union, by Stalin.
Hmm. Well, I'm definitely gonna look more into his story. It sounds even the his ending is
Yeah.
tragic, but to have done that kind of work in his lifetime is amazing and inspiring. So, as an expert in Jewish history, how have you seen the field evolve over the course of your academic career? What are some of the notable developments or new perspectives? And I'm wondering, even as I'm asking this, if the current situation has made changes to that, has shifted that, because I know I can't really remember, but I know I was speaking about, because we're speaking about this regularly, but it seems like people, when they said, well, this is what we did, but given the current situation, and then they continue it with like almost like there's a question mark now on what's ahead, what's to be taught, what to address. What are your views on that?
Oh, that's such a great question. I mean, that's a whole separate kind of conversation, but I'll give it to you as succinctly as I can. So, first of all, in terms of the way the field has evolved, it's expanded. I mean, there are just more and more areas of inquiry. So, when I was starting out, for example, I think the study of women's history, women and gender, was in its infancy. It's become a very important part of the field of Jewish studies as it's become part of the field of academic scholarship in general. Um, there's also greater interest in other parts of the world where Jews live. So I think for a long time, really the focal point of studying Jewish history often tended to be Europe. Eastern and Western Europe. There's been much more interest in Jews of the Middle East and North Africa and how that affects the story. And then, of course, I mean, Israel and Zionism, which was always a big part of it, has become more and more front and center. And most recently, probably in the last 10 or 15 years, with this resurgence of anti-Semitism in America and Europe, there's been new ways of trying to imagine where we are. I would say when I first started out, in the 1980s, there was this sense that anti-Semitism was diminishing and maybe was becoming more marginalized, and maybe the situation would continue to improve. And that was probably true until maybe 10 or 15 years ago, when we have the emergence of not only one but two different strains of anti-Semitism. That right-wing anti-Semitism, from white supremacists who see Jews in one negative way, and left-wing anti-Semitism, mainly from people who are growing out of an anti-Zionism, and so that's added up to this resurgence in the last 10 years, which makes it challenging. So the other thing you asked is how it affects teaching. I can only speak personally. For me, it doesn't affect at all. I continue to teach what I think is important. So, for example, this fall at Wayne, my course, which was my scheduled course, is called Israeli Society and Politics. And I would have taught this course whether it was this situation or not. Though I think in the current situation, and there's so much misunderstanding about what Israel is and what Zionism is, I think this course has become more important. And as you can imagine, there's some blowback to me teaching this course, but it doesn't matter. The students who want to come and learn, they have a right to learn, and I'm going to teach it to them the same way I always did.
And it's a need right now. I know that we connected, as I had mentioned earlier, because of what's happening. Just naturally, you start learning more. You want to learn more, and we connected the other day on Tuesday because of a project that you're working on right now about Detroit. This is one of the questions about the neolog movement in Judaism and a history on the Jews of Detroit since 1967. We met about that because you were trying to learn about the Chaldean Jewish relationships. And I got to tell you, I loved how we had such a healthy conversation. I brought up a couple of questions. You responded with interest. I mean, I'm interested too. That's why I come up with questions. I love questions. Honestly, I'm not trying to, get into arguments. I'm genuinely trying to learn something, and coming to it with an open mind. And I love the conversations that we had. I'd like to learn a little bit, if you can share a little bit about the project that you are working on. And then, we can leave with a few words. I think that conversation, the meeting that we had the other day, just for me represents how peace looks, in that room between. That was like
Absolutely.
lovely. It energized me. Like it's like, oh, okay, you're responding to this, and I appreciated that you were also interested in what I had to say. There was no defense on anybody's side, but we'll go back to that in a little bit. What share with us about your project that you're currently working on, about the one in Detroit.
Yeah, well, first of all, just to clarify, the Neolog project, that's a religious movement that was in Hungary. That's a different. These are two separate projects. But the Jews of Detroit project, basically, there have been histories of the Jews of Detroit until 1967. There are a couple of those. There's a very good one by a woman named Lila Corwin Berman called Metropolitan Jews. So my history starts in 1967, and what the project is mainly about is about how Jews built a vibrant Jewish community in the suburbs. Because really in the 60s, even in the 70s, most experts, most sociologists and others, they didn't think that Jewish identity could be sustained if Jews were going to be spread out in the suburbs. The notion was the reason that the Jewish community of Detroit in the city was so vibrant is that Jews were concentrated in one neighborhood or another, either in the Dexter neighborhood or near Bagley Elementary School in the Northwest Detroit. But without that neighborhood, it wouldn't happen. And what I've discovered in studying the Jewish community, the suburban Jewish community, is even though there have been challenges, in many ways, the exact opposite happened. The Jewish community was able to thrive since the 1960s and handle challenges and adversities. And one of the reasons or the ways they were able to do it is that, first of all, this Jewish community is an enormously generous and giving Jewish community in terms of supporting institutions and charitable endeavors. And Israel, I did a lot of interviews for it, and I interviewed members of the Jewish community who have been leaders and active for the last 50 years. And one of the things they all say, they all point to something, and this is something that has been, quantified, is that per capita, the Jewish community of Detroit outperforms every other Jewish community in North America in terms of supporting the Jewish Federation, in terms of Jewish education, in terms of charity, in terms of support for Israel. I grew up here. I did not know that. I always knew this was a great Jewish community. I didn't know that, and that isn't something that just Jews in Detroit say. There was a sociologist in Florida who actually studied it, and the Jewish community of Detroit just they outperforms everyone else. The one exception maybe is Cleveland. Cleveland is maybe a close second, but in the suburbs, Jews here were able to build these vibrant institutions, synagogues, youth movements, the Jewish Community Center, which really, it's had troubles recently, but really until maybe 10 years ago, was this thriving hub where Jews could come together. And even though Jews didn't have that one neighborhood like Dexter or Northwest Detroit, they built smaller neighborhoods in different suburbs. The other day when you mentioned Little Baghdad in Sterling Heights, there have been parts of Oak Park and parts of Southfield and now parts of West Bloomfield and Farmington Hills where there is a concentration of Jews. So it's never 100%, but it's enough to have that critical mass of committed and active Jews who are really involved. The other thing is the Jewish community, many Jews in Detroit, their connection and their affiliation and their identity is not necessarily driven by religious observance. Because in terms of observing Jewish laws and customs, that's been diminishing steadily for decades. But there are many other ways for Jews to be involved that aren't specifically religious in nature. For example, charity isn't only religious. There are other ways helping other Jews. You can do that without being a religious person, and these are the things which have enabled the Jewish community, and to my mind, really to thrive in the suburbs.
As you're speaking, I thought this is, we were talking, Mary Romaya was at the meeting with, who was our former executive director, and she was a teacher for 45 years. So she has an enormous amount of knowledge, and she was born in Detroit, and is Chaldean American. And she was talking about how the Chaldeans geographically followed the path of the Jewish community. But now when you're just saying this, because I often, when I talk, I say, we have in Michigan, we have the largest population of Chaldeans in the world. We have the only ones that we're strong with. We're the only ones that have organizations that are established here. Given, we have a lot of economic power. We have, and in the state, and then the Arab American community is pretty much similar in the United States, where Michigan is powerful in that sense. So that is kind of interesting, where I don't know if we've like moved from our original region of Iraq and kind of somehow found this way to get along over here, and live in that way of a peaceful way. Um, and with that, I was wondering, because we're connected. By the way, given what you just said, I've reached out to the Holocaust Memorial Center. I remember when I first became executive director in 2019, and Mary Ramaya and Judy Jonah, our chairperson, would say, you can reach out to the Holocaust Memorial Center. And in the past, I had relationships with the Arab American Museum, and I reached out to them. But the Holocaust Memorial Center is geographically, it's just closer to us. So we've reached out to them several times, and I can't tell you how quickly they respond and how helpful they are. So what you're saying is from experience, and I wasn't just going because it's they're Jewish or not. They had that reputation that they will help if you reach out to them, and that has been the case since 2019 until today. So there's
I think
so
that's
much.
hard. That willingness, that interest, that almost in eagerness to work with our non-Jewish neighbors and other communities. It's just baked into the fabric of the Jewish community. I mean, the
Yeah.
Jewish community doesn't see itself as somehow being isolated or living in a vacuum or segregated or sequestered. No, we're part of a larger metropolitan Detroit Jewish community, and especially with the Chaldean community. I mean, we're really seeing kindred spirits here with a similar history and heritage and similar opportunities and challenges in America and in Detroit. So it's a natural synergy. It's a natural partnership between the two Jewish communities.
And I like that you're giving credit to the success from the giving. That's the thing. There's sometimes these misconceptions or stereotypes of the take, but it's really the given that brings things around. What goes around comes around, kind of belief that helps a community grow. So that's a lot to learn from that as well. And with that, we just had a very nice conversation. This is our second nice conversation that we had in 1 week. Healthy conversations where we're both learning and we're giving and taking. And what message, as a teacher, as somebody who's worked with students for all these years, and with all these different universities, I mean, the list of some of them who have gone through difficult times recently. What is some advice that you would give students so that they can find peace within, and that they can find the kind of peace that they're wanting outside, in the outside world? What advice would you give them
It's a
right now?
great question. It's a great question. So I like to tell students two things. First of all, I often tell students that yes, there are these very difficult problems, and right now we're living in difficult times. But the one things that younger people, that students have, that I don't have, even though I've spent a lot more time studying these things, they have a fresh perspective. And young people and students should embrace the fact that they have that fresh perspective. They're going to be able to see possible solutions and ways forward that an older generation that's kind of stuck in the box in existing paradigms is going to have more trouble to see. Someone is going to solve these problems, and it's young people who are going to do it. The other thing I tell them is that it's much easier to be pessimistic than it is to be optimistic. And I always prefer cautious optimism. And I'm not saying being Pollyanna or being utopian or idealistic, but it's easy simply to lament and see the bad things. And we happen to also be living in an age where there's a media model. There's a media industry whose business model is to try to make us feel as outraged and frightened and angry as they can. For some reason, that's profitable. So what I encourage students is try to see, don't settle for despair and pessimism. Try to find the ray of hope. Cautious optimism is difficult, especially at a time like this. But if you can do it, it's much more productive to see a way forward, to imagine a way forward, than it is to settle simply for wallowing in the present or lamenting the past.
That was so beautiful. I totally agree. I mean, it's not about ignoring what's happening. It's not about feeling like, you shouldn't get involved and try to do something, but it's keeping that positivity that sometimes in the chaos of everything, you almost tend to want to draw in that direction, but you could create more damage. I remember I was watching The Crown one time, and the Queen was saying, you know, nobody realizes how difficult it is to stay neutral. Everybody was telling her they thought she was taking the easy way out, and she pointed out to them how difficult it is for her not to take action that could be detrimental or hurtful. And it was kind of, I thought, oh wow, like we don't give ourselves that patience and that space to allow to hear the other person, or to have it's mostly really patience. And in an American way, we're always in a hurry and we're impatient, you know. But I so enjoyed your wisdom today. Really, it was great. I mean, you make me want to feel like I want to go back and take a couple of classes at Wayne State University just to
My
learn.
door is always open. Come
Thank
in
you. And to
anytime.
have this
Always
kind of
open.
a conversation, I really missed that when we were, you know, talking and everything like that. So I really appreciate you making the time for coming on today. It was a wonderful conversation. And, you know, Michigan, you feel so proud, and I'm so proud of Wayne State to have these kind of professors there. It means a great deal.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Anytime.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful day.